Hello, hello, hello. It's the Bureau of Lost Culture again, and I'm still Stephen Coates. Now here in Soho, if I look out through the window, I can see that spring is springing, and spring will be followed by summer. And that means that thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people in these islands will leave the city behind and head out into the country to attend a festival. In so doing, they're following a tradition that goes back 5,000 years in these islands. Now recently I saw a wonderful documentary that's called Free Party, A Folk History, and it focuses on just a few years in that 5,000 year tradition, towards the end of the 80s and the early 90s, when two tribes came together. And when these two tribes came together, an extraordinary new thing happened. An extraordinary new story, really. And we're going to hear about that story today. But before we do, come and join our free festival, our free party, bureauoflostculture.com. Apparently the free parties, it was common for the organisers to go around with a bucket into which people could make donations. Well, we've got a digital bucket if you'd like to donate to our wild endeavours, and we would thank you for it. Or you can just support us in any other way you like. You can write us a letter, for instance, as increasing numbers of people are doing. Recently, I've heard from Velvet Phil, Billy, Bo, Julie, Jenny, and Pete. And it's always a pleasure to hear from friends. You can get our Bulletin of Lost Culture or share these stories with one of your countercultural friends. But for now, kick off your sandals, blow out the candles, tune in, turn on, drop out, as we go back in time to witness a clash of cultures. A clash of the counterculture, in this case, the tribe of the urban free party scene, young scallies with sound systems playing an extraordinary new type of music. And the older tribe of new age traveller communities, some of them veterans of the 60s and 70s, others people who'd gone on the road, as it were, in the changed social circumstances of the 80s. And their clash was with the mainstream culture. In this case, the culture of landowners, farmers, the authorities, the National Trust, English heritage, and of course right-wing politicians. That collision became violent at times, as we will hear, and it translated into legislation which I would suggest has curtailed the ancient rights of all of us, not just the ravers.
It was a coming together of very large events.
The times have been so repressive and so unfunky that all it took was a little crack in the dam for the dam to explode.
Thatcher's era, unemployment.
A lot of industry was closing down, lots of empty warehouses.
Acid house, orbital raves, died a death.
We can do better than this. Do it yourself.
We thought, fuck this, we're going to do it ourselves.
We decided all things were possible, especially with nothing.
Let's do a rave in that big old warehouse over there and get 5,000 people in.
This is a free party, all day long.
Underground, illegal, free, warehouse spaces, outdoor.
We met these travellers at Glastonbury in 1990 and it just clicked.
That pivotal Glastonbury changed a lot.
It was a sort of life-changing moment.
There was a free festival circuit that the existing travelling community would do every year.
Each festival, more and more ravers were coming in. It was a real eye-opener seeing this whole other subculture.
Ravers and the travellers crossed over.
And that whole thing grew and grew.
You can dance the night away under the stars and no one's going to fucking stop you.
Ecstasy and the ravers reinvigorated the whole free festival scene.
I can see why the press got hold of it.
New age travellers, not in this age, not in any age.
Well, here to discuss it is the director of the documentary mentioned, Free Party, A Folk History, Aaron Trinder. Welcome to the Bureau of Lost Culture, Aaron.
Very, very nice to be here.
Yeah, well, listen, first of all, congratulations again on Free Party, A Folk History.
Thank you very much.
I think it's a very important history. It's like a sort of social history document. How did it come about?
I'm glad you think of it as a kind of social history, because I think a lot of people will lump it into being a music documentary, which of course music's a strong driving force of it, as it was in some ways the social movement that the film is about, which was something I was aware of back in the sort of late 80s and early 90s. For anyone of a certain age and of a certain kind of ilk, I suppose, with a countercultural persuasion from that era, I think what's amazing in a way is that story hasn't been told before. Thatcher's demonisation of the travellers, and then consequently the rave scene and the laws that came in.
Have you got a history in that scene yourself?
For sure, yeah. My mother's from I suppose a bit of a hippie background. So I was always growing up kind of thinking, what's going to be my version of that when I'm the age she was. She's a very sensible hippie is the way I would probably describe it. I suppose from a kind of countercultural world. We grew up in a housing association that had previously been squatted street of abandoned houses that were actually under threat of being completely knocked down because it was a bomb had gone off on our street. And so I grew up in a very almost a semi-communal kind of environment, but largely it was all the mums when all the dads had all gone to India on the hippie trail.
Surely not.
Funny that, isn't it? It's always the mums kind of having to pick up the pieces. So grew up in a very female environment with all the kind of mums looking after the kids. But it did kind of, I suppose, introduce me to that world. Fairly hard kind of existence, but community was part of that story. But I was always kind of aware of, I suppose, the hippie story. Loved Jimi Hendrix, loved Pink Floyd when I was a teenager, all that kind of stuff. But then this new music was arriving. And in a way, it was sort of one particular summer, I remember it very well. 1988, the Acid House.
Second Summer of Love.
Year Zero was also the first somewhat psychedelic experience I had. Right. But that was on top of Glastonbury Tour at a free festival that I just literally stumbled across.
So 1988, Glastonbury Tour with a bit of chemical assistance.
So ironically, I was just on a cycling holiday with my mate, and we had turned on the transistor radio and heard thousands of hippies are gathering at Glastonbury Tour for the 8th of the 8th, 1988, which was considered some sort of auspicious date on the kind of hippie calendar, the traveller calendar. Yeah. So we thought, well, we were only about 5 miles away. Let's go there. And it was mind-blowing because it was the tail end of the free festival movement. I had no idea at this stage about what the history of that had been. But yes, I crossed the threshold into the somewhat psychedelic experience. A minute dose of something that had a little picture on it. So in some ways, that was embedded into me as being a kind of a place of mystery.
God, lucky you. What a start to one psychedelic journey, Glastonbury Tour. I mean, you can't get deeper than that.
Yes, indeed. And then, and of course, but when I came back that summer, we were all going to sixth form, and when I arrived, literally, maybe 3 or 4 weeks later, everybody, I was still a bit of a hippie, everybody had smiley T-shirts and everything starts with an E badges. And I was like, what's all this stuff that's going on? And at first I was a little bit resistant because I was into guitar music and fairly quickly, I suppose, kind of succumbed to the fact that there was this new energy that felt very akin to the hippie thing, but with this amazing futuristic music that had come from Chicago and Detroit. And seemed to be a blend of the psychedelic sense of the music I was listening to with kind of communal aspect of the dance floor, which is, irresistible. It goes on all night and creates a trance-like experience. So
you got that major sort of early experience and early induction into that particular form of psychedelic music. And then you become a filmmaker. And when did it sort of come and knock on the door again and you think like, hold on a minute, there's a film to be made here?
Well, like I said, I was always amazed nobody had made that film because it struck me as such a kind of incredible time between 88 and 93, I suppose. It was pivotal in my life because I was around 20, 21, where you're in a way defining your identity, all of the things the big things in your life you decide are going to be important in your life are those things you start to pursue, which for me was, music, art, film, culture. And I was always amazed that, well, nobody's ever done it. And I'd also spent a lot of time making music, so I was involved in DJing and that kind of world. I was always aware that, yes, making a living doing film is one thing, but there's projects that you want to get off the ground that you care about. That's why you originally make art of any description, is you have a passion for specific things that you want to make. I kind of made the foolhardy decision to start about 5 years ago, kind of in my spare time, because I had a few contacts. I looked down the list of all, thought, actually, I can get up tomorrow morning and I can make a phone call. And in the spirit of the DIY principle, I can get started. And so I did, and thought initially it was just going to be a short film idea. I thought I can make a short film about one particular free party that I went to at the Roundhouse, which was obviously another countercultural kind of mecca from the 60s through to the punk era, and you won there.
Infamous event there, right?
Very, very much so.
Right, so, and of course that features in the film, and maybe we'll talk a bit more about it. As you point out, the Roundhouse is this kind of nexus in some ways, isn't it, of counterculture, yeah. But, so you started off with the idea of making a short film about that event, and then it's expanded out to cover this period. It's a sort of short period in time in a way, isn't it? But actually very significant, I think, in terms of, as I said at the beginning, social history, because it seems to me that it documents a major shift in this country, which actually really hasn't been talked about enough. The erosion of public rights, effectively, you know, the rave scene and the free parties, in a way used as an excuse by the establishment to take away the common rights. But that was 5 years ago you started.
I mean, like I say, I kind of started with the idea of it being a short film, and then quickly, as soon as I started to interview people, I realised that I can't really let the whole story go because nobody's done it. And if I, in a DIY way, basically just kept going throughout the last 5 years, you know, we're in our festival run, but that doesn't necessarily mean that this is the kind of eventual film that will be released to the world. That's still another hurdle for me to overcome somehow, because as an independent project, we've done it totally off the hoof.
So let's dive into it. And in terms of, you know, for people who don't know, as I didn't really, actually, the narrative history which it's covering is this time of these free parties, which are both in the British landscape, out on common land, but also in the city. Background to this had been the free festivals of the sort of 70s, the famous Stonehenge festivals, and you know, throughout the 70s. And then at Stonehenge, you'd get the sort of the first time when the kind of police and the establishment get involved in 1984, right? And they kind of wrap Stonehenge in sort of barbed wire and prevent people from coming and celebrating the solstice there. And that's the background to it, even though the film starts a bit later. And I think one of your interviewees, you know, talks about the fact that people have been gathering to have raves effectively for 5,000 years in this country, haven't they? You know what I mean? Sort of shamanic way. Tribes coming together to, often at these places where there are prehistoric monuments, as we call them now, you know, and then really this thing happened in 1984 when it was stopped, right?
I mean, the free festival movement, if you like, was the offshoot of the counterculture of the 60s, which were the people who didn't want to go back to normal life in a way. Lots of people who went to free festivals would have been, I suppose, weekenders, but a lot of people decided that it was going to be their full-time life, and they wanted to live communally and in some ways nomadically. So they may live on the road, literally, in converted buses, or they might have lived outside the system at sort of one of the kind of many communal places that sort of sprung up in the 70s. And of course, as a counterculture, it had to have a home, and those homes tended to be these free events that were all around the country. And the biggest one of those free events became at least Stonehenge, the People's Free Festival that was possibly initiated at Windsor. But for the next 10 years, the countercultural home became Stonehenge, and that started maybe with a handful of people and some bongos and a campfire, and quite quickly through the 70s gathered steam and in some ways was kind of reinforced by the countercultural movements that were happening around the country. In, I suppose, the punk world, people started to kind of gather, and also the increasing social deprivation of the inner cities drove people out, and they became interested in alternative ways of living. And, well, do you want to live in a kind of a shoebox in a council estate in kind of the centre of a very rough part of a city, or maybe you could get a bus quite cheaply and live on the road and have maybe a slightly more utopian stab at life.
Just to remark that, you know, this is what we call the Thatcher era as well, and, you know, there was lots of social deprivation, as you say. There's increasingly wide division between the haves and the have-nots. The yuppies and the sort of making huge amounts of money, and then lots of people in the cities in particular living in difficult situations. So there's lots of societal issues going on as well, right?
Absolutely. And I mean, I think when you are living a fairly kind of dystopian lifestyle and you're maybe a fairly young person and you kind of know that you're going to be part of the 1 in 10 joining the dole queue and your future looks pretty mapped out as pretty bleak, well, hey, there's some people kind of having another kind of experimental way of doing things, so a lot of people over the sort of 70s into the 80s started to join up with that lifestyle, and they were all quite disparate. I mean, there's a real idea that somehow travellers were all the same group of people. They weren't at all. Actually, there were lots of subdivisions. People from that, a very original 60s countercultural utopian story, and then people who were brickies and couldn't find a job and decided to hit the road and join the convoy, But
plus what we call gypsy travellers, which is, the original Romany types, but also Irish travellers. There was those communities which were always here, weren't they?
Yeah, I mean, they weren't necessarily part of Stonehenge, but they certainly were still a presence in the landscape of the country, and they were increasingly finding it harder and harder to live that life. I suppose the sort of pivotal moment is that the Stonehenge Festival got very, very, very big in 1984, and there was a confluence of different kinds of events which made the government decide they'd had enough. Partly this was to do with the fact that we were at the kind of right peak of the Cold War, and that area is a very militarised part of the country. Right. So not only were there hippie communes and hippie convoys kind of arriving to Stonehenge for a 6-week-long free festival, well, they're right next to
Ministry of Defence on Salisbury Plain, right?
And cruise missiles being moved
yeah.
around. So very powerful landowners who didn't want all these hippies on their land, and a certain degree of open drug selling and kind of anarchic principles being a threat to the state. They'd had enough, and in 1985 they decided it wasn't going to happen again, and hence the so-called Battle of the Beanfield.
Here is a sidebar about the Battle of the Beanfield. On June the 1st, 1985, a pivotal clash took place near the village of Savernake in Wiltshire in England. It would become known as the Battle of the Beanfield. This confrontation was a clash between the authorities and a group of travellers who were attempting to set up the annual free music festival at Stonehenge. The roots of the conflict can be traced back to the 70s, when the Stonehenge Free Festival first began. Initially, the festival was a low-key gathering of musicians, artists and countercultural enthusiasts who would converge on the ancient Stonehenge site each summer solstice. But over the years, the festival grew in size and popularity, attracting thousands of attendees. And this led to increasing tension with local authorities, who viewed the festival as a nuisance and a threat to public order. In 1984, the local council decided to ban the festival altogether, citing concerns over traffic litter and public disturbance. The decision was met with outrage from the festival's organisers and supporters, who saw it as a direct attack on their civil liberties and freedom of expression. Undeterred, the travellers decided to go ahead, regardless of the ban. They gathered a convoy of around 600 vehicles, including caravans, buses and trucks, and set out from various parts of the country, converging on a Wiltshire countryside near Stonehenge. On the morning of June the 1st, the travellers found themselves confronted by a massive police presence with around 1,300 officers deployed. What followed was a chaotic and violent confrontation, with the police using riot gear, batons and water cannons. The battle lasted for several hours. Both sides sustained injuries. The travellers were eventually forced to retreat. Their vehicles and personal belongings were seized and destroyed. In the aftermath, the incident was widely condemned as a heavy-handed and disproportionate response by the police, with allegations of human rights abuses and excessive force. Dozens of travellers were injured. 537 were eventually arrested. This represented one of the largest mass arrests of civilians since at least the Second World War, possibly one of the biggest in English legal history. 2 years after the event, a Wiltshire police sergeant was found guilty of actual bodily harm as a consequence of injuries incurred by a member of the convoy. In February 1991, a court judgment awarded 21 of the travellers £24,000 in damages for false imprisonment, damage to property and wrongful arrest. In the years following the Battle of the Beanfield, the travelling community continued to face increased scrutiny and restrictions, with the introduction of new laws and policies aimed at limiting their movements and activities. This, in turn, as we hear, led to further clashes and confrontations as the travellers sought to defend their rights and maintain their way of life.
Stonehenge was just the excuse. They knew how strongly we all felt about Stonehenge and knew that was a good reason. But the real reason was the threat to the state. As I said, the growth of people, the numbers of people was doubling every year. For 4 years, well, that was a huge number of people that was suddenly flocking into buses or whatever and living on the road. And the festival itself, once it became to be a month long, it functioned perfectly well. It had its own economy, it had its own system for everything, and was so successful in that sense that it must have been a huge threat to the state. It was anarchy in action, and it worked, and it was seen to be working. And it was seen to be working by so many people that they wanted to do it too and wanted to be a part of it.
Come out, then. Come out, son. Come out. Just calm down. On the deck! On the deck! No. On the deck! Now stretch your arms out. Stretch your arms. See what they're doing to us!
What we, the ITN camera crew and myself as a reporter have seen in the last 30 minutes here on this field has been some of the most brutal police treatment of people that I've witnessed in my entire career as a journalist. There must be an inquiry. I don't know what the results will be of it, but at this stage, the number of people who've been hit by policemen, who've been clubbed whilst holding babies in their arms and in coaches around this field is still to be counted. What the end result will be, we don't know, but there must surely be an inquiry after what's happened here today.
When I got back to ITN, and during the following week, and I went to the library to look at all the rushes, most of what I thought we'd shot was no longer there. And from what I've seen of what ITN has provided since then, it disappeared. And particularly some of the nastier shots that were taken of the battle in the Beanfield of the woman being dragged out by her hair, I know was filmed.
What happened to me that day was the worst day of my life, and I can't ever foresee having anything happen to me that could be worse than what happened to us there that day. Then I can say that day that I had in the witness box must be my best day of my life as a contrast, because it was such a good feeling to be able to stand up in public and say, no, this is how it happened, this is what happened to me, I'm telling the truth.
The Beanfield itself was obviously a year after the miners' strike, and force of the law was not just police. They were army parachute regiment with undercover who'd been drafted in effectively to just give the convoy a kicking, make sure it never happened again, arrest everybody willy-nilly, scare them, intimidate them, beat them up so much that it never would happen again. And off the back of that, the 1986 Public Order Act was the legislation that was brought in, which for the first time, I think, as far as I know, since Elizabethan times, trespass had become part of the Crown's power. So before that, a travelling group would park up on a bit of land. The farmer would come up and say, look, how long are you going to be here? Well, we might be here for a few weeks. Okay, look, you've got till next Wednesday. If after the Public Order Act, the laws have shifted more in favour of state just having the power to intervene, even if the landowner has actually not made any complaint. And that's obviously continued. And in a way, the rest of the film kind of documents that the Free Party side of the story became the catalyst for the next legislation.
Yeah. So this target sweeps everybody in, isn't it? Including these new age travellers, the people that you said have been on the road maybe since the 70s and 60s and 70s. But also it started to target actually traditional gypsies as well, right? They all rolled them all in, didn't they?
Yes, of course. The Public Order Act was dealing with issues that the state had with people living alternative lifestyles, whether that was traditional travellers or new age travellers, but also a certain element of, and became even stronger later, of the right to roam and the ability to access the countryside, because if suddenly you can't gather, well, what about those scouts that just always used to go to this place? Well, now they've got to make sure that they're not breaking the bylaws, etc.
So I just want to bring something else in. House music had come from Chicago, and then there'd been the big rave parties, which actually started to happen sort of on the outskirts of London in the M25, etc. It's also part of the themes which happened next, because those parties themselves had gone from being something rather underground to various kind of like money-making criminals that got very interested in them, right? So
the music arrived from Chicago, and the British young people, like they have done for decades, they've very quickly realised how exciting this new, very small scene was from America. It happened, with the Northern Soul thing. It happened with punk in a way. Punk was a very small thing, and it kind of blew up in the UK. So we're very good at that, of amplifying of something and turning it almost into a youth culture, which definitely happened with acid house.
Powered by acid and ecstasy.
I would say that the confluence of the repetitive beats, this incredible music from the future, and these new substances, which kind of dissolve the barriers between us to a certain extent and give a utopian feeling, certainly was a magic combination. And then I think part of the parties getting bigger and going out of the cities, and let's not forget, this is not just around the M25, but it was also Manchester, it was also Blackburn, it was a lot of, the warehouse scene in other parts of the country. It was using empty spaces often. So the M25 raves were often in old aircraft hangars, for example. So maybe you can get warehouses, because the warehouse party was a thing, but bigger than that, you've got to go outside of London, you've got to go outside of Manchester. And of course these big M25 events particularly may have been the first time some of these kind of youth had even left London, left the council houses. So they may have got a sense for, wow, there's this sort of world outside, and suddenly they're off their face and they're coming back from a party and they're seeing the countryside for the first
fields
time.
And there's a cow there.
Absolutely, because the convoy on the way there, and where's the party? But these events were illegal, but they were paid, they were ticketed actually. So they would have quite heavy security involved. They would often be quite expensive, the ticket. They would give a glimpse of this kind of magical, illicit, kind of secret world, but
at a cost.
And still, in some ways, adhering to the traditional gatekeeping. You can't get into the party if you can't pay your money. And then these parties started to get so big that, of course, and drugs being involved, it was pressure from two sides. First of all, the gangsters started to realise this was the way, if we ran the door, we also run the drugs. We control the money, and the people who were running it, had to either say yes to the gangsters or they were in deep shit. And then the police became very interested, and obviously the police group that was set up were called the Pay Party Unit, where the concept of what comes next sort of kind of borrowed from an illegal paid party that you've bought a ticket for. It's not licensed. The pubs shut at 10:30. We've got to remember licensing laws were pretty tough in the 80s.
There was no fun to be had after 10:30.
There was no fun. I mean, Thatcher didn't create a fun environment for anybody other than the yuppies, really, So young people, of course, they wanted to go out and do things late at night. And actually the only place to do that was illegally, really, unless you went to very high-end clubs. And then once the Pay Party Unit started busting all these big paid events, there was a choice to be made. Party promoters, do you become kind of part of the system and you pay your taxes and you go mainstream and you've got door policies and that, or do you do something else? But the punters who've been going to all these events, they were like, well, that was really good. We loved the going out to the countryside. We loved all of that. Once these big illegal events outside the M25 and the likes were clamped down on, the police figured out how to block the roads, to shut down the sound systems, etc. And they were left in some ways homeless, looking for that glimmer of this incredible new world that they felt in a field, on a dance floor, outside on ecstasy, with people that they'd maybe never shared time with before, people from all different social classes, races, sexualities.
One of the responses to the police party unit was that some of those people did go mainstream, and that was the foundation of the big clubs, wasn't it? This
clubs.
Cream and Fabric, and still going today, a lot of them, But then the response from young people who didn't want that anyway and couldn't afford it was set the ground for all people like Spiral Tribe to actually start to do urban free parties, particularly inspired, I guess, by things like Notting Hill Carnival, where you've got the sound systems, and as we were saying earlier, where you've got this time when it's possible to occupy buildings, right?
We're talking about a sort of an era that, a lot of people think of Thatcherism sort of somehow bringing us into the modern era, but most of urban spaces was still lots and lots of empty industrial space. So there'd not been a repurposing of urban cities. So from the likes of London, swathes of it were still effectively industrial spaces that they hadn't been gentrified. They hadn't been turned into funky arts venues. They hadn't been turned into flats. They were still empty. And so post 89-90, a recession kicked in, possibly the first since the Thatcherism had promised that, we'd never have that again. The poll tax riots happened with the young people basically being denied the right to be engaged in democracy, and a certain element of, well, we're just going to start to do things for ourselves kicked in. So, there've been warehouse parties certainly in industrial spaces in London and, the likes of Blackburn and Manchester and other places throughout the 80s. But when Acid House arrived, it was the perfect music for it. Fits the space of an industrial space to have this incredible industrial music from the future in an environment, covered in, lasers and smoke and projections and the like.
And then you get these two things, don't you? You've got the urban free parties, as it were, squat parties, and then these people who, post Beanfield, the travellers are out in the country, right? And you have this thing where these two sort of tribes, as it were, come together. This thing happens for a few years, right?
Yeah, and it feels like the moment that those two worlds met. And the poll tax riot was March 1990. There was a famous event that happened in Trafalgar Square, which was the Freedom to Party protest, which was where all of the big M25 type ravers sort of gathered and had a kind of protest against the new legislation that had been brought in, a piece of law that basically said you get 20,000 quid straight away if you're a pay party organiser. And then June 1990, the travellers who had been, effectively made homeless by the Beanfield had been given a temporary home somewhat because they worked on the Glastonbury Festival, and they would have their own field and their own kind of mini festival off the side of Glastonbury.
This is a brilliant bit in the film. I love it, actually, where you show that, I'm sure listeners are aware of Glastonbury Festival, but it's become this behemoth now. It's a corporate behemoth, isn't it, in a way? It's incredibly expensive to go to, even if you can get a ticket. But this is back in the days when it was still quite shambolic and sort of, Michael Eavis was a sort of hippie Christian farmer and welcomed the travellers who had been sort of stranded by what had happened. And then so they got this festival inside a festival, the Travellers' Field, down a kind of lane or something, wasn't it? And through the trees, then you sort of popped out through this kind of arbour into this different world, right?
Absolutely.
What I loved in it as well is that a lot of the people who were travellers, from the 70s and 80s, they were kind of into Hawkwind and that kind of, rock sort of, with a bit of punk mixed in as well, and, Crass type bands and things like that. And then the people from the city turn up and manage to sort of get a tent and get a sound system and then start pumping out this music for the future. And the travellers are like, what the fuck's that?
Yeah,
disco shit, that's what the guy says.
Yeah, Harry from DIY. Yeah, I think there was a certain bemusement, as in, the travelling scene was dwindling to a certain extent. The travelling events were getting smaller. And the one bigger thing that they did have was the free field at Glastonbury, which 1990 was the last one. And that just happened to be the summer where, the rave scene had gone almost overground, as in suddenly you were getting, rave tracks on top of the pops. There was a sudden feeling of like, this blossoming world isn't going away, but it hasn't got a home. And then, some adventurous, if you like, urban sound systems found their way into that field where, they often had the infrastructure of the party, but maybe not the music because of the concept of a free festival. It was often, well, we'll put up the tent and then whoever wants to come along and play can come along and play. Well, they weren't necessarily expecting it to be, the best hi-fi sound system from the Tonka sound system from Cambridge, who, prided themselves on having the toughest, best sound and these sort of great DJs playing music from that kind of acid house.
Over a period of about sort of 4 or 5 days or whatever it was, they assisted by the disco biscuits and the things that were going on, from this, what's this disco shit puzzlement, and what are these people wearing like day glow and rather than tie-dye and stuff. And then by sort of day 3, one of your interviews describes it as 2 tribes came together. Yeah.
Well, I think that one of the lines that someone said is even the most hardcore punks were getting into it, as in this isn't going away. And maybe it was a sort of light bulb going off. This is a way to continue this story that had kind of felt like it was on its way out as a result of the Beanfield. The travellers knew the countryside. They knew the laws around common space. They knew where all of the somewhat secret places where you could get around the bylaws that you could put a party on. And interestingly, a lot of them were ex-MOD places, places that were maybe airstrips in the Second World War or internment camps, and they understood about space. And then the urban sound systems had their finger on the pulse in terms of the people, the music. And for the next 2 years, I think 2 to 3 years after the pivotal moment at Glastonbury 90, it was a kind of a match made in heaven.
A match made in hell for the establishment, wasn't it? But so you've got the music and the sound systems, and it's worth mentioning, there's Bedlam DIY, you mentioned, of course, Spiral Tribe, Circus Normal, Circus Warp, Circus Irritant. But the travelling community, they knew how to, in fact, the reason they were at Glastonbury, wasn't it? They knew how to build a festival in those days, to put up the infrastructure, the generators, how to dig the ditches for the loos, to put the tents up and stuff like that. So, and then of course they knew the green lanes and the secret ways and byways of old Albion as well. Because in Glastonbury, this was the final year, wasn't it? Because again, the establishment don't like what's going on. Michael Eavis, bless him, under a lot of pressure. The police put pressure on the insurance companies that say you're not going to insure this again. So he sort of says, okay, that's it, right?
Actually, I was at that Glastonbury 90, and the fact that the travelling side of it, the free festival part of it, had become kind of big, and a lot of people had gone to it. To a certain extent, there was also a clash because Michael Eavis had his reasons, but he hired a sort of security firm, and that security firm and the travellers clearly we're never going to see eye to eye, because the security's job is to keep everybody in line, in check, and apparently they were fairly corrupt, and I think Eavis has openly admitted that in latter years, and they were in conflict with a anarchic group in the Travellers who had come from Stonehenge, which was all about, bring what you expect to find. There is no law apart from yourself. So the idea of a security firm in some ways enforcing some kind of rules on them meant that there was a clash, and
almost a medieval battle clash, in fact, right?
It's been described by many people as a medieval battle because, and it's literally described as the Battle of Yeoman Bridge, which is the bridge in the centre of Glastonbury. I think a very unfortunate event because it meant the Travellers could never really return, because Eavis had a choice. Well, he can either have an event that has security and has some limits and rules to it, or he had to just scrap the whole thing. But clearly those two groups of people were never going to get on. The Travellers complained a lot about security's intimidation, sexual assaults, and all kinds of horrible accusations, taking drugs off them and then reselling them. The classic bouncer trick that happened again in the M25 stuff. So, but I'm sure the Travellers weren't perfect either in terms of things that were going on. But that
catalyses what happens next, because then without this home, this kind of Glastonbury home, they sort of go back on the road, but now they're with the urban guerrillas from the city with the sonic weapons of the sound systems.
Yeah, one door closes, another door opens. It's all about where the next possible space is. And for them, that was the opening up fact that maybe these free events that they've been doing actually might have another groundswell of people, punters turning up from the cities who would pay at the cafe, who might be able to sell their wares to. All they've got to make sure is they get the urban sound system going, and they're going to get a lot more people to events that were potentially sort of dwindling.
So over the next few years, you get Pepperbox Hill, Barnard Stacey Airfield, Longstock. Peasdown, St John, Morton Lighthouse, these places all around the country where there's gathering for these parties. Generally sort of out of sight, but not always, where there's quite often on common land, as we said before, or old airfields, and with various degrees of sort of attention from the authorities. What struck me as well, somebody used the word lawless at one point, but in a positive sense, because it was like self-policing. And I'm sure there were problems. Of course, there was a dark side to it. But generally, it was all very peaceful, wasn't it? The problems that seemed to occur were actually clashes with the police themselves, not within the actual festivals. I mean, they did seem to be lawless in a very positive way, right?
Yeah, and I think, like you say, I'm sure that there were many issues that come up as a result of, there being a certain degree of tolerance for behaviours that are considered more extreme than you would normally be allowed to have. That being said, in a way, having an outlet meant that, well, it's an outlet, so people kind of can do more extreme things and not come up against the normalities of the status quo. But certainly, as soon as the police started to become more draconian in their policing of these things, then you create conflict, and you create conflict with a group of people that already feel a bit demonized and already have already had long-term experience of being demonized. That will create more extreme behaviour, particularly when it comes to, being forced to go from one place to another, not being allowed to settle, not being allowed to park up, and often these events have, the big outdoor ones often happened over the summer. So it was easier to kind of go from place to place and for it to be a little bit more. But then in the winter, travelling people certainly had to have a park up somewhere that they could kind of be a bit more secure. And so, with enlightened landowners or enlightened kind of police, you could kind of manage it. You could imagine it being, well, look, you're allowed to be here for a bit, but then you've got to move on in January. And, with a certain tolerance, it can work. But when the police really started to change their tactics, felt like it was in the move into 92.
Yeah. But there was a couple of summers where everybody's on the road, free festivals. Then in winter, going back to the cities and carrying new parties, as you say, all the travellers kind of holding up somewhere. Yeah. And then you mentioned earlier the Roundhouse in 1992. Yeah. And that was quite something, wasn't it? Because again, it's come up in this show a few times. The Roundhouse, famously, Allen Ginsberg there in the 60s. Yes. Yeah. And then various other stuff going on, and then derelict, right?
It had been derelict for something like 10 years, I think, at that point.
A big building in Camden town. And it gets taken over at Christmas.
91 into 92. Yeah.
Four parties. But the New Year's Eve one goes kind of like horribly wrong, doesn't it? Again, dodgy bouncers letting too many people in. Then the power goes down. It's completely black. The music stops.
So I went to at least two of these parties because I'm from North London, and Camden was our stomping ground when I was back in London. And I went to the Christmas Eve one, and it was like, oh, this is fun. Look, and you could just walk in. There was I don't know, maybe 300, 400 people all dancing around the sound system. Sound system wasn't massive, so you kind of had to get a bit close. So I remember us going, this is brilliant. And there were people saying, oh, we're going to have parties all the next couple of weeks. So it was on our radar of the thing to do on Christmas Eve, on New Year's Eve, of course, a week later. And from all the discussions I'd always had of both my experience and other people that I knew, it was always so interesting how polarized the experience was. Some people literally saying, that was the best weekend of my life. It was the most mind-blowing. I had an incredible time. Other people going, that was the worst night of my life. And so in some ways it encapsulated, and it's often described by everybody as a kind of like a portal from one moment where somehow this was all kind of idyllic and it was all going very well, to crossing over into another sort of sign of things where it all starts to go a little bit pear-shaped. And I think what really happened on New Year's Eve was that it got too big. It was way too big. So what they did was kind of panic a tiny bit or get security, who turned out to be, like security tend to be in this story, corrupt and try and rip people off. That created tension on the door. and then the power went. And it was then inside in a huge building with no power on New Year's Eve.
Terrifying.
And it was a bit scary. Of course, for me, I was wondering, we were just going, whoa, this is mad, isn't it? Going into the catacombs and finding people, making fires and having conversations. It was just a mad experience, but other people didn't have as great a time. But it was a sign that this had got very, very big. And the urban spaces were maybe not going to be able to handle the numbers that are going to want to come to these sorts of events because...
Well, it's going overground, which is what always happens with the underground. It starts to go overground, and actually, really, that's when the authorities start to get rattled, don't they?
Yeah.
And then there's the Acton Lane party, which happens afterwards in West London, where, on this occasion, the police get really brutal, don't they? They kind of effectively break in. They start smashing up the sound systems. They attack people.
The tactics that potentially were used at the Beanfield was suddenly allowed again, which was rather than now come along, turn off the noise. You've got till you've got to be out of here by Monday, and make sure can I send the fire brigade in to check that there's no fire challenges here? And sensible policing. They just decided to go in hell for leather, smash through the doors. And just started attacking people willy-nilly.
So we've got to teach them a lesson.
Let's give them a kicking. Let's scare them so much and let's smash up their infrastructure.
So they won't do it again.
So they can't do it again. In a way, very similar tactics to what happened at the Beanfield. Not saying, not comparing them in terms of the damage that they did. But what they did was effectively a violent attack with police with no numbers on. So clearly they knew they were going to do something that they didn't want to get.
A change of mood was happening then, wasn't it? It's the underground's going overground. Yeah. The people who are actually involved in it, maybe for the first time, start to get paranoid.
Yes.
They feel like they've been actually observed, surveilled, targeted, right? They've been threatened effectively, right? But they're back on the road in the summer following, and then I suppose just forward winding, things are still kind of like happening as they've been the previous couple of years, but then it sort of peaks at Castle Morton, doesn't it? Here is another sidebar about the Castle Morton Common Festival. Castle Morton was a week-long festival and rave held in the hills near Malvern in Worcestershire in England between 22nd and 29th of May 1992. The media interest and controversy surrounding the festival and concern as to the way it was policed inspired the legislation that would eventually become the Criminal Justice and Public Order Act of 1994. In May 1992, Avon and Somerset Police had tried to end the annual Avon Free Festival, which had been held in the Bristol area around the Maybank holiday for several years. As a result, hundreds of New Age travellers en route to the area for the festival were shunted into neighbouring counties by Avon and Somerset's Operation Nomad police manoeuvres, with West Mercia Police deciding to confine them to common land at Castle Morton. The first travellers arrived on the common on the 22nd of May, but the high-profile coverage in the national and international media only served to swell the crowd further as ravers from far afield made their way to join the festival, thus making it an impossible task for the authorities to close the event down. An estimated 40,000 people gathered at Castle Morton Common for the party, which lasted a full week, the biggest of its kind since the Stonehenge Free Festival. The police attacked festival goers on the way out after the festival was over. 13 members of Spiral Tribe were arrested after the event and charged with public order offences. After a lengthy and costly trial, they were acquitted.
It is now a containment operation.
Chipping Subway one year was 3,000 people aiming for the festival. Next year it was Castle Morton.
From the air, the sheer scale of the invasion of the Common can be seen, achieving the dubious record of being Britain's largest ever illegal rave party.
It was our Woodstock. The police were powerless, and utopia had arrived.
It was that point you realise, well, what's going to happen now?
Things started changing from that point.
Castle Morton Common, which if anybody's ever been to, is sort of, the borders of kind of, Worcester heading towards Wales. It's a beautiful area, huge, great big common, which hadn't been used actually for festivals before then.
And Avon Police, amazingly, rather than sort of persecuting the people in the convoy, basically say, look, if you just move to the next county, in other words, out of our jurisdiction, well, forget about you.
Absolutely.
Right? Then you get this 36-mile-long convoy heading to Castle Morton.
Yeah.
From setting up and all these different sound systems coming, right? And I think, and again, one of your interviewers described it, because they just kept coming all night, didn't the people? He does it as a river of light, a river of electric light. You know, the cars come in and more and more people are gathering there, right? I mean, how many people was it in the end?
Between 40 and 100 and something thousand, because obviously people come and go over the period of time. And it went on for a week. At the weekend, it would have peaked because obviously it was the long bank holiday weekend. So people would leaving work on the Friday. Oh, there's a massive illegal rave happening in the Malvern Hills. Well, what else are you going to do?
Well, I mean, in the old days, you know, for these raves, you might have had to sort of, you know, ring a number or, you know, get a flyer and, you know, and it was all kind of very secret. This is on national news, wasn't it? It had hit the national news, it had international news, in fact, right, wasn't it? And it's absolutely comical in a way, isn't it? Because the newsreaders are saying, that, you know, there's all these young people gathering on, they're taking drugs and there's this music going on and stuff. And then right at the end, they sort of say, so we're encouraging people not to come. And it's like, you know, every young person who heard that news report is going like, I'm going, right?
Boiling hot bank holiday weekend, and someone's basically told you there's an enormous free rave
party going on
all weekend.
Are you coming or what?
For sure, that the kind of media's decision to demonise it was its own worst enemy, because if they'd have possibly just ignored it, it would have been half the numbers possibly at best, because it would have been word of mouth, and it would have been.
Well, of course, it wasn't in their interest to ignore it, because then it's sort of over, isn't it? But some people stay on site for a bit, probably a bit too long, and then on their way out, the police are waiting for them, right? And then they arrest loads of people. They impound the vehicles. They impound the sound systems. And it's like, okay, we're going to take you to court. You know, we're going to prosecute you, you know, and it got very frightening suddenly, didn't it?
What happened is on the Wednesday or the Thursday, they finally found some laws that they could use that meant that they could evict people on the common. But they were also clearly to do something else, which was a more political choice, which was to make an example of somebody. And it happened to be that Spiral Tribe were at that point the most well known, because they were quite media savvy. They were also the people who had appeared actually on the news a couple of times.
They had an ideology, didn't they, which they believed that what they were doing was kind of right at some level, right?
Yeah,
you know, that so you know, like squatting in posh houses that were been left empty, you know, when you're homeless was a reasonable thing to do, and that, you know, to have these free parties, you know, on common land was a sort of right. Completely. So they were vocal about that, and therefore they drew a big target on their back, didn't they, from the authorities? It's like, if you're going to get any of them, get these lot. And I think also there's a sense that they waited until the mass of people had left because they couldn't take on such a big crowd.
Yeah.
But when you've got the kind of stragglers or the last people remaining, who were there actually clearing up effectively, weren't they? They were actually clearing the site, making it clean again.
Yeah.
And they picked on them as they left, didn't they?
Yeah, and I think they had decided that Spiral Tribe would be a kind of a landmark, you know, precedent that they could set. That if they tried to blame Spiral Tribe for setting up the whole thing, well, you know, any traveller / you know, free party kind of contributor will tell you nobody organises it. You know, it's not easy to legislate against that. So what they had to do was to pick a group. They arrested them, they pounded all their vehicles, which is where they were living, of course, because they were on the road full time, and effectively made it, you know, impossible or very, very challenging to do similar events like that again. And so that the rest of that summer, in a way, is the story of how the police really got, in a way, their act together. They figured out how to bust the parties. They figured out the tactics.
And then the next big thing that happens, of course, is the Criminal Justice Bill in 94, where, you know, they actually attempt to 20 people assembled in a field listening to music with repetitive beats becomes a criminal offence.
I know.
And despite massive protests, I mean, and not just protests from the people who are the festival people, there's lots of people who just believed in, you know, the rights of people to gather and stuff, you know, protesting. But it becomes law. The scene starts to break up really at that point, doesn't it? Because, you know, people feel threatened. And this is moving towards the end of the film and towards the end of this particular window of social history. Because even though Spiral Tribe get taken to court and actually it's dismissed, quite rightly, you know.
Only up, but after 3 months, at the time, the most expensive case in Crown Court history, it was something like £4 million spent on this insane, 2 to 3 months.
Pointless,
case.
huge waste of money.
Complete waste of money. But in a way, because that court case failed, the next thing to do was effectively an extension of the 1986 Public Order Act to create the Criminal Justice Bill, which, yes, like you say, despite a huge reaction from not just kind of raver groups and traveller groups, but there were 100,000 people out on the street trying to fight against this legislation, which should be an interesting thing for us in our current kind of situation now to ponder upon. It went through at the in the end of '94. You're right that in some ways what that did was it fractured the scene, because certainly that legislation brought in an even more draconian set of rules for people who lived a travelling lifestyle. Effectively, you couldn't gather more than something like 12 vehicles in one place because you were automatically doing something criminal. And what it did was it drove some of the existing sound systems out to Europe where those laws hadn't quite come into place.
Yeah. And also, I mean, some people are getting older, right?
Yes.
Some people are having kids. Some people maybe want a career after all. Some people want or just want a kind of quieter life. You know what I mean? And some people start making music professionally as well. Some of the DJs. So it does start to fracture. And as you're right, you say that. So the sound systems start to go to Europe, where certainly at first in Berlin and Paris and France, they get a welcome. It's a lot easier. They're not getting harassed, are they? The festival scene kicks off in Europe, and it's amazing. It's yet another British invention, like the Walkman and darts, football, whatever. It's gone abroad and become much more successful, isn't it? It's absolutely classic British. And it goes to America as well. And Tonka, they go to the West Coast and. You can even see how things like Burning Man and stuff, start to come out of that whole scene, So it lives on. And I think that, of course, things like Reclaim the Streets and Occupy and the protest movements that come later, have got their roots there too. And as you say, we're at a time now, aren't they, where the right to protest is going to be legislated against. It's all. If you were to sort of take, just as a sort of thought experiment, and just take the side of the establishment for a moment, what would you say against it? If you could put yourself in to become a Thatcher or a John Major or a Dweller Braverman, why should this thing be resisted?
I mean, from the perspective of the establishment, I think that they're doing two things. First of all, they're trying to keep themselves in power. And so for them, they need to find a folk devil to do that, usually. We've got folk devils now, asylum seekers this and, protesters that and, environmental activists this. So I understand as a sort of self-preservation method that politicians, certainly on the right, will find folk devils. I think also that there's a certain element of, radical culture is unpredictable. And any government, if you like, is there to, in theory at least, protect the larger group of society. And so probably from their perspective, they thought, well, this thing could be out of control, and control is what governments do, right? They have various steps of recourse, and at the top of that is violence. That's the way it is in the end, what they can do is they can bang you up, or they can brutalize you. So in some senses, it's not a total shock that a government would want to control something that at its very heart is about self-organisation, because obviously what comes with self-organisation is no taxes. What comes from self-organisation is unpredictability, potentially social change that they don't want. So while it's very hard for me to put myself into their perspective and agree with it, I can certainly see the reasoning that they did the things they did and continue to do in terms of demonising minorities or to divide and rule, it is largely the tactic that's been done, particularly governments in some sort of trouble. And let's face it, John Major, certainly in the 90s, was really struggling. So he chose his enemy, and he literally says squatters, ravers, traveller. He literally says who they are. Yeah, they were an easy target in the same way that single mums was the target at some point. dole scroungers was the target. Usually when a government wants to push something through, it finds a somewhat vulnerable subculture or area of society to pick on, and we're seeing it right now, aren't we? So
yeah, and that's the dark side of it. But I wanted to end on something slightly positive, right? Which is that obviously the festival scene's a massive part of the economy now, ironically, of course, all around Europe and in this country. Right? It's a huge thing, right, isn't it? So it's become the underground really has gone overgrown. As ever, the counterculture has become the culture. But when we last met, when we were doing the In Conversation, talking about and showed the film, what I really liked was that in the audience at the end, there's a lot of people who from that scene and of a certain age and kind of bemoaning everything that had happened and stuff. And then suddenly there's a couple there, a young couple there.
Yeah.
Puts up his hand. The guy puts up his hand and says, "Hey, we're still doing it." He was about 21 year old, wasn't he? And he was saying like, yeah, you don't have to worry, guys. It's like, we're still doing free parties. Just that you don't know about them. Because guess what? They're underground, as it should be, right? You know, they're still going on. But I thought that was an amazing moment.
So many of them come up to me, tap me on the shoulder afterwards going, "I absolutely loved your film. It was really inspirational. But look, we are doing it." And show me some WhatsApp of, the party that they're going to on Friday or whatever, that's all done in a high-tech but still kind of secret way. For sure, the sort of the story now is that as much as we all love to go to the big mainstream festivals, I mean, they are for people who can afford them. Young people can't afford to go to a £400 ticket festival and then spend tenner a drink for an entire weekend. Older people can't afford it. It's a very tough time for a lot of people, but people will always want to gather together. They will always want to dance and in some ways enjoy each other's company, young people particularly, but everybody wants to do what they've done for, as we mentioned at the start of this, for 5,000 odd years. Celebrate the solstice, celebrate the equinox in a free fashion, in maybe outside, maybe under the stars. That won't go away just because of the sort of requirements of the state to have a kind of a fence around it and a wristband, and young people, being as they are, somewhat utopian and somewhat kind of naive and good for it, will push towards those experimental places that maybe the likes of you and I are more kind of reticent to do now. Use their ingenuity to sort of push culture into the future, and also to still create places of unity and community for each other, which, let's face it, is kind of the stuff of life, isn't it, really? So I am quite hopeful that impulse won't ever go away. And yes, a free party is definitely one of those things that even with the most draconian government in power, and young people will still find a way.
Long may they continue. Aaron Trinder, thanks very much for coming to the Bureau of Lost Culture.
It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much to Aaron. I will put a link to his wonderful film in the show notes. It's currently touring the festival circuit in the UK and the US, so do see it if you can at a local venue. And I trust it will get a wider release by streaming soon. It really is a beautiful and poignant history. You might have your own stories and histories of that time, and we would love to hear them. Of course, it was a complex time. And, the police acted in a way which would be completely unthinkable today, but it is good to remember that wasn't all of them. Many of them, including some high up, were actually very sympathetic and kind to the festival goers and travellers. And they were, after all, acting on the order of politicians. As guilty, I think, in a lot of these cases were the private security gangs who, as we heard from Aaron, were super corrupt. I'm also going to put links in the show notes to two previous shows. Once with Chris Tofu, my friend, about his experiences of free festivals, and one with William Wiles, who was responsible for breaking into buildings and holding squat parties himself in the 90s. Next year, it's 40 years since the Battle of the Beanfield, and we're planning to make an anniversary event about it. So if you've got any personal testimonies, maybe you were there, we would love to hear from you, including if you're a landowner, a farmer, or just happen to be in a village nearby. I can understand how you might have some issues with what was going on. But, to paraphrase Mahatma Gandhi, first they ignore you, then they laugh at you, then they fight you, and then you win. And it's worth remembering, I think, that these festivals, like many other countercultural things, went from being underground and resisted to being a massive part of our economy and entertainment industry. I know of two rather posh landowners who do very well at the festivals each summer. Well, whether you're into a festival or not, I hope that you spend some of the coming months with us here at the Bureau of Lost Culture. We'll be digging up, excavating, reanimating more lost, forgotten, half-remembered stories. And we hope to see you over the hillsides, down the road, round the bend, for more tales from the counterculture.
Bring what you expect to find. If not you, who? If not here, where?
It's a coming together of people, allowing you to celebrate life through music.
To open up the space and to give the space to the people.
You could go and do what you want under the stars. Brilliant music, tunes you know, getting high, having fun. I mean, that is freedom.